All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Ash Jogalekar, as some of you know, and I'm extremely pleased to be here today with Bill Lanouette, who has written the definitive biography of the Hungarian-born American physicist Leo Szilard. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have watched the movie Oppenheimer, which has become very popular in the last 1 year. It was nominated for a number of awards, including, I believe, 13 Academy Award nominations. And you will see a man with who's silver-haired, silver slicked back hair. He flits in and out of just one or two scenes, and they don't really dwell on him at all. He's just featured for a few seconds. He speaks a few lines, but if you actually think about who that man was, he was at least as important as all the other famous scientists in the movie, Oppenheimer, Richard Feynman, Albert Einstein, Hans Bethe, and so on. And he was a genius, just like some of them, but he was the genius in the shadows. And that is the title of Bill's definitive biography of this very unique maverick physicist,
Yeah,
Leo Szilard. Exactly. And so, my purpose here today is for those of you who might know a little bit about Szilard or don't know about him. I really wanted to talk to Bill and let Bill tell you why Szilard was not just one of the most imaginative minds of the 20th century, but why his ideas, in some sense, are even more enduring than the ideas of many of the other famous scientists that we have heard of who worked on nuclear energy and the Manhattan Project. So welcome, Bill. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
delighted to be with you.
Yeah.
Well, I think Szilard is important because he personifies the role of the scientist in society. He wasn't just in his lab and he wasn't just doing things theoretically. He was always trying to apply science to real life and to social problems. He wrote at one point his own 10 Commandments. And the first one, I think, sums up this whole approach. He says, recognize the connections of things and the laws of conduct of men so that you may know what you are doing. And he had a rare ability, I think, to see the future. James Watson once said he used to like to hang around with Szilard because he got excited about something before it was true. And he also, I think, tried to, in many ways, to recognize and reconcile science and its consequences.
Yes, I think that's a very fine summary, Bill. And when you were saying that, I was reminded of C.P. Snow's famous essay about the two cultures,
Right.
where he talks about this rift between scientists and, well, physical and natural scientists on one hand, and social scientists on the other. And it seems to me that Szilard was one of the very few who could straddle both those realms with his interest in both science and politics and social issues.
A good example of that, I think, is his PhD thesis, which he did at the University of Berlin in physics, working with thermodynamics and laying what became the basis for information theory. When he finished that, he went to the university and said, I'd like to do another PhD in economics, because at the time Germany was suffering from
Mhm.
terrible inflation. And and they said, well, a PhD shows that you're a important thinker, and there's no need to do two PhDs. But the fact is, he would think about economics and think about politics every bit as excitedly as he would think about science.
Yeah, yeah, definitely a very what we would call a very multidisciplinary thinker, and certainly a man ahead of his times. But what I would like to do is start at the beginning because I think it's very interesting to understand how his childhood environment might have played into his thinking and the way he thought about the world. Because This was a very unique time in the history of the world, certainly in the history of Europe, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the 19th century was at its peak.
It was, and Budapest was the co-capital with Vienna, and it was an intellectual center. Szilard grew up in I would say, a rather intellectual family. His father was an engineer who worked designing and building railroads, and he himself thought he wanted to be an engineer, and until he got to physics, he studied engineering. But he grew up with a private tutor until the age of 10. John von Neumann did the same thing and then went off to high school. And I think this gave Szilard a freewheeling sense of how you, first of all, discover knowledge and then how you integrate and what you do with it. And there's really no limit to how you think across several disciplines. And that was, I think, an attitude that he had all his life.
Right. And the whole matter of private tutoring to me is fascinating because just the other day, I forget what article there was, but I read an article which was sort of lamenting the absence of private tutoring and talking about how private tutoring was very common. I mean, not everyone could afford it, but it was pretty common back in those days in Europe.
Oh, the prosperous middle class
Right.
Jewish families in Budapest and also in Vienna would frequently hire a tutor. Szilard had a tutor for different subjects like math, and he also had a governess. He first learned to speak French as a kid. In fact, German was his first language because the family tended to orient towards Vienna and German rather than Budapest and Hungarian. So German was his first language, and Hungarian his second, and French was his third.
Hmm.
And so he was quite international, and I think just felt comfortable being a citizen of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Um, and tell me a little bit about the high school that he went to, because Hungarian high schools then were among the best in the world, especially when it came to math and science. Isn't that
Right.
right?
Yeah. Well, there were four famous Hungarians who ended up in the Manhattan Project. Um, and they were joking around at one point about whether they, in fact, were infested with extraterrestrials because these Hungarians spoke an unearthly language and were superhumanly intelligent. And there was a big joke in the Manhattan Project about calling them the Martians. The four Martians were John von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller. Their education is interesting. There was a Lutheran gymnasium, which was considered the best certainly in Budapest and maybe in the whole empire. That was 3 doors from where Szilard lived. John
Hmm.
von Neumann and Eugene Wigner went there as students. And they had a teacher there named Ratz, who was a famous mathematical scholar and teacher. Szilard instead went to what they called a real school, which you would almost call, I think, a trade school. He wanted to be an engineer like his father
Mhm.
and studied engineering. He didn't do the classics like Greek and Latin. And then the fourth one, Edward Teller, went to something called a Minta, which was an experimental school, socially experimental, and I guess you would say uh, liberal by American standards. So it's not true that they all went to the same high school, but no matter what high school they went to, they came well prepared.
Right. And that, yeah, that certainly had a formative influence on the way they thought and everything that they learned. Now, another aspect of their upbringing that I wanted to briefly discuss is that Szilard, um, just like von Neumann, Teller, Wigner, was Jewish.
Yes.
And how did that, at that time, what was the state of the Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and how did that play into how all these people and their families thought about the world?
Well, there was a Jewish middle class that became increasingly important in the empire. Szilard was born in 1898, and around 1900, or the first decade of the 20th century, um, there was a movement where rich Hungarian businessmen, I guess you could say, were given royal appointments and titles, and they were very cautiously
Hmm.
integrated into the society. And they were welcome not only because they had deep pockets, but because they had connections all over Europe, and they were considered a rather admirable elite. Um, Now, that all changed in 1919 when there was briefly a communist uh, republic under Bela Kun, and then he was tossed out by Nicholas Horthy, who was a fascist and was very anti Semitic.
Hmm.
And so at that point, in 1919, Szilard, who was at the uh, technical university, um, had to stop studying. All the Jews were fired from their academic posts, and students were prevented from going to the state universities.
Hmm.
So things changed very dramatically for the Jews in Hungary, thanks to the fascism of Horthy in 1919. That's why Szilard left
Yeah, and
Budapest for
uh,
Berlin, which was the new center of science, probably the most scientific
right.
city in the world at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
But then
And
again, when Hitler came in, he had to leave Berlin. So, as a Jew, he was on the run as politics shifted in these different important countries.
right. And clearly these political upheavals left a deep imprint on the minds of all these scientists. I mean, as we know, for one thing, it made Edward Teller fiercely anti-communist as well as anti-fascist. Uh,
Right.
did it also breed a similar kind of mindset in Szilard?
Um, I don't think he was anti-communist in the same way. I think von Neumann and
Mm.
Wigner and um,
And Teller, certainly.
Teller were all what you would call hawks.
Yes.
And as the Soviet Empire grew in importance, especially after the Second World War, they became fiercely anti-communist. Szilard, on the other hand, thought of himself, I think, as a socialist. And
Mm.
when Bela Kun was tearing Budapest apart with demonstrations and trying to put together a communist republic, Szilard rejected that, and he formed with his brother Bela the Hungarian Socialist Students Association. He wanted to mediate between the royalists on the one hand and the communists on the other. And
Mm.
I think all his life he was resisting being forced into one political viewpoint or another. And he was practical enough to try to find compromise. But he was the dove in the Manhattan Project, and the other three were all ended up being hawks.
Yeah, that's right. And I think his earnest desire to seek compromise and avoid being placed into any kind of a political box. I think that's an enduring, this is certainly one of many enduring lessons for today when people seem to be politically polarized.
He had a good example. I have a good example of that. In 1952, Eisenhower was going to become the nominee of the Republican Party. And Adlai Stevenson was the nominee of the Democratic Party. Well, Szilard was fairly well connected with politicians, and he went to Joe Rao, who was a Democratic, I guess, leader or activist at the time, and he said, "Look, Joe," said, "Stevenson has no chance of winning. We should have a different approach. Both the Democrats and the Republicans should nominate Eisenhower for president, but then pick their own vice president."
Huh.
And so he thought that would be a perfect way that we would get the president everybody wanted, but then for political and ideological reasons, we could also get the vice president we wanted. Well,
Again,
of something, it would be nice if that worked,
well,
That's
it
how
would
he
be
thought.
right, right. It would be nice, and again, this is an idea that was like many other Szillardian ideas, so ahead of its time, because now as you know, they talk about ranked choice voting, where
Yeah,
you pick anyone you want for president and vice president and so on. It was also the way I believe that they voted at the country's founding. At the very
yes,
beginning, they would just cast whoever got the most votes would become president. Whoever got the second highest votes would become vice president effectively.
exactly. Yeah.
So that is very interesting. But going back to Szilard leaving Hungary, as you said, he went to Berlin. That time, Berlin and Germany was really the world capital of science. That's where quantum mechanics was developed by Heisenberg and Pauli and Born and so on. Um, is that what he wanted to study? Was his interest in going to Germany to study theoretical physics and quantum mechanics in particular?
No, I think that surprised him. He wanted to be an engineer. And when he went to Berlin, he went to the Technische Hochschule, which
Hmm.
is a technical university. But he became bored with what he was learning there, and he heard about seminars at the University of Berlin, at which people like Einstein and Planck and von Laue and we're all sitting around and talking, and he started attending these conferences and then struck up a friendship with Einstein. He wasn't intimidated about going right to the top. And then he switched and went from the Technische Hochschule to the University of Berlin. The and the Friedrich, I think they called it Friedrich Wilhelm University at the
Mhm.
time. And he then switched from engineering to physics.
I see. And so, I'm sure his training as an engineer definitely came in handy when he worked on inventing new things and sort of more on the practical side of things.
He was very practical, and I mean, the big reason that the U.S. had an A bomb and Germany didn't was because of something practical that Szilard had learned when he was studying chemistry somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that was if you want a chain reaction and you want to slow down the neutrons so they have a better chance of colliding and splitting the atom, then you need a moderator. And a popular moderator was uh, graphite.
Mm.
And Szilard knew that graphite was made electro uh, through electrolysis. It was made and in the process created boron. Now boron absorbs neutrons.
Mm-hmm.
Szilard knew that commercial graphite would probably, with the boron, would choke off the chain reaction. So when he worked with Fermi in New York and then in Chicago, he went around and made sure he got 99% pure graphite. And as a result, their chain reaction worked. The Germans tried graphite, not knowing this,
Mm.
and it didn't work. So they had to turn to heavy water
Mhm.
moderator to slow the neutrons, and the US destroyed their supply of heavy water. So by 1942, the Germans said, there's no point in continuing. We can't make any useful invention here or weapon before we win the war. And so in June of 42, they shut down their research into making a nuclear weapon at the same month that the US handed it over to the Army Corps of Engineers, and it became the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
So there's that interesting thing that Hans Bethe said the Germans didn't have the bomb because they didn't have Leo Szilard, and it's true.
Yeah, it was very fortuitous, his confluence of knowledge in engineering and physics. But going back to Berlin, I know that there's a few students listening to this conversation, and the one of the lessons I take away from his tendency to go to the top always and not get intimidated is that students should learn to do this, because if you are in a department where there might even be a Nobel laureate on the faculty, there's absolutely no harm in just going and talking to them. And that's certainly what Szilard did. Whether it was scientists or politicians, he always went to the top.
Well, as you know, at the time in the early 20th century, uh, in most countries, society was very stratified, and
Correct.
the academic world was very stratified. And if you were a professor, I mean, you were like an archangel in heaven, and you had stature. But on the other hand, you took a personal interest in your students. To take a course, you had to meet in Germany. You had to meet with the professor, and he had to agree to have you in his course. Now, Szilard was not intimidated in any way by the hierarchy, and he sat near Einstein and then ended up walking him home. They lived in the same neighborhood, and they struck up a conversation and a friendship. They were both lateral thinkers, meaning they
Hmm.
wouldn't just zero in on one topic, top to bottom, but they would integrate music and philosophy and chemistry and all sorts of things in their conversation. So it's absolutely right. I think professors are human beings,
Hmm.
and they were students once. And I think the point is that you can know them on several levels, not only by their publications, but also by their conversations.
Exactly. And of course, his friendship and collaboration with Einstein led to one of the most unusual and unique inventions that I can think of, and that certainly speaks again to Szilard's practical bent. This was a refrigerator, if you can say
Yes,
a few words about that.
yes, they were reading the newspaper, and um, they saw that a family had died because the gas used for cooling the refrigerator had leaked into the apartment and had asphyxiated them. And they were thinking, how can we have a refrigerator with no moving parts? Because it's the seals and it's the pumps that could leak.
Mhm.
They came up with the idea of an electromagnetic pump. Imagine, if you will, um, a tube that's filled with a liquid metal,
Mhm.
and then the magnets surround this, and the magnets force the liquid metal through the system. Now, there's no need for a valve and there's no need for a pump,
Mhm.
because the electromagnetic pump from outside the system moves the liquid metal coolant. And they've filed a couple of dozen patents on this. Uh, it turned out that about this time, Freon was discovered, which was non-toxic, and that ended up replacing the toxic chemicals used. But also the refrigerator that they invented, as somebody said, howled like a banshee. It was just very noisy by the way a liquid metal was being shunted around. But it did become the basis for the cooling of liquid metal fast neutron reactors after World War II.
Well, I mean, that's fascinating, I think, for several reasons. First of all, Szilard had a practical bent, but as you know, Einstein also, and a lot of people don't appreciate it because of his work on relativity, he had a practical bent because, as we know, he started out as a patent clerk in the Swiss patent office in Bern. And so he was also a man who could think really well in practical terms, and in spite of being a rarefied theoretical physicist. Um, but also what is interesting is that this is just a personal anecdote. I worked at a company once, and the head of our IT department, he heard me talking about the Szilard Einstein refrigerator to a colleague. I said, "Oh, I think my parents had one of those." So there was some design. I don't think it was the exact same one, but some design that was based on the original idea by Einstein and Szilard. So clearly they sold at least a few of them.
Uh-huh. And such refrigerators have been made, some even recently, and they do work.
Right.
But they don't work as well as Freon worked for decades.
Right. And the irony about this, and I get the feeling Szilard might have appreciated this, is Freon, of course, is not toxic to human beings, but it is quite toxic to the environment and
Terrible.
and the ozone layer. So maybe the Einstein Szilard refrigerator is waiting for a comeback. So that's where he collaborated with Einstein. And you said before that he wrote this pioneering PhD dissertation that married thermodynamics with what we now call information theory. And later, other people like Claude Shannon, in particular, who is the father of information theory, they picked up on these ideas. Did he influence Shannon, for instance, or von Neumann, who also worked in that area a little bit directly? Did Shannon refer to his work?
He did. He taught a couple of courses with von Neumann at the University of Berlin before the two of them fled in the early 30s. And they brainstormed about a lot of things, not specifically about what became information theory, but the two were very easy with one another in brainstorming. Shannon was a pioneer in what became cybernetics or information theory. And in the 50s, they invited Szilard to a couple of conferences. And Szilard said, well, that's something I thought about before, but now I'm interested in arms control and biology. But I mean, they acknowledged that, in fact, he had laid out the principles of information theory. But as was typical, once he had the idea, he loved to move on to something else.
Right. Yeah. And that brings us to the pivotal event in Szilard's life, or at least one that seems pivotal in retrospect, which was hearing about the lecture given by Ernest Rutherford in London in 1933. So first of all, what was he doing in England in 1933 after his
Well,
sojourn in
Szilard,
Berlin?
as I said, was quite visionary politically as well. And as he saw Hitler gaining power, he kept warning his relatives in Hungary, saying, you have to get out. If Hitler comes to power, we're all finished. He, in the spring of 1933, he was living in a faculty club in Berlin, and he said he had his two bags packed. So he was ready to go. He knew that something terrible was going to happen. And then after the Reichstag fire in February, he said, this is it. Hitler at that point got extra powers and
Right.
was really taking over. And so at the end of March, he got on a train and went to Vienna. And the next day they closed the borders and checked people, especially Jews, for their valuables. he said to succeed in life, you don't have to be smarter than other people just one day earlier. But he saw it coming. He warned people like Michael Polanyi, you have to get out. Hitler is really going to be a menace. He went to Vienna, and there he met some economists he knew and ran into William Beveridge, who was the director of the London School of Economics. And he was warning these academics, look, we're going to have a terrible flood of refugees. They have to be settled. You have to find jobs. And Beveridge said, well, why don't you come to London and pester me and maybe we'll do something. And so Szilard moved to London into the Imperial Hotel on Russell Square and walked down Southampton Road to the London School of Economics and pestered William Beveridge, and they founded the Academic Assistance Council, which is something that's still going today under another name of settling refugee scholars. And they saved people like Teller and Beta and found them jobs in the 30s as they were being forced out of Germany. So he had this practical bent, and he could see problems coming, and he ran around. He went to Belgium, he went to France, trying to find out if they had university jobs for these people. So he was really quite concerned about academic freedom and the survival of European academia.
Yeah, definitely a man on the move and in the service of a moral cause. And so clearly that's what found him in London in September 1933.
Yeah.
And some people think that he actually went to a lecture by Rutherford, but he didn't go to the lecture. He,
No, he wanted to go, but he had a cold.
oh,
So
I
he
see.
read about it the next day.
So he read about it, and what does Rutherford say in his lecture, and what's Szilard's reaction?
Well, Szilard read in the Times that Rutherford was talking about the transformation of atoms. And he said that anyone who is, and this is a paraphrase, anyone who is expecting any practical energy from the transformation of atoms is talking moonshine. Well, Szilard didn't really know what moonshine was. He found out, but then he realized, as he said of Rutherford, that an expert is someone who tells you what cannot be done. And so he took that as a challenge and said, I'll show Rutherford how you can release atoms, the energy in atoms. And he was pacing and thinking about it. Now, this was a lucky time for him because just a year before, the neutron had been discovered.
Right.
The model of the atom at that time had negative electrons circling a heavier nucleus that included protons, and we didn't know until 1932 also neutrons.
Mm-hmm.
And so Szilard, thinking that the resistance people thought of a positive nucleus and a negative electron wouldn't work, said, well, what about a neutron? A neutron has no electrical force, and it might very well penetrate an atom. So if the neutron hadn't been discovered the year before, Szilard wouldn't be in such a lucky position to realize this. But he was standing on a street corner, walking around London, thinking about what Rutherford had to say, and it occurred to him that if you bombard a nucleus with neutrons and it makes the nucleus unstable and more than two neutrons come out for every one that goes in, you would have what he called a chain reaction. And within months, he filed a patent for the nuclear chain reaction.
Mm. And was, this is one of those moments in the history of science where you wonder, was it just an inspired guess? Was it something in someone's background that led them to think that way? And in Szilard's particular case, I'm wondering if his training in engineering and chemistry had already predisposed him to thinking about chain reactions in chemistry, which I'm not sure, but I believe that they were known at that time.
They were. Chain reactions were known. No, I think it was science fiction that really got Szilard going. He loved reading science fiction. He wrote some himself later in life. But in the late 20s, he met H.G. Wells in London, and they were speculating about travel to other galaxies. And they Wells said, well, the only way to do this would be with some kind of atomic energy. And in 1913, before World War I, H.G. Wells had written The World Set Free, which
Mhm.
is a novel that predicts a worldwide atomic war in the 1950s. So Szilard had talked to Wells about this, and in one of his recollections, he said, when I thought of this, I said, H.G. Wells, here we come. And here is a way to release atomic energy in a way that might, in fact, allow us to make rockets and go escape our own galaxy. So I
Yeah.
think it's science fiction as much as chemistry that had Szilard thinking about this.
Yeah, that meeting again sounds very fortunate because when I think about it, I see some parallels between H.G. Wells and Leo Szilard. H.G. Wells, as you know, was very knowledgeable in science. In fact, he wrote a textbook of biology later with Julian Huxley, who was a
Right.
son of Thomas Henry Huxley. But Wells, just like Szilard, was deeply concerned with social issues, with economic, political issues. He was a great social critique, a political commentator. So I can see why that was also a kind of meeting of minds between the two of
Sure.
them. Now, Szilard had this prophetic epiphany while crossing that street in London in 1933, and he filed a patent. Did he actually publish his ideas anywhere?
No, he was afraid of publishing anything because he had just left Nazi Germany, and he knew that they were very competent nuclear physicists in Germany, and that they would think if they might very well think of this as well. And so the last thing he wanted to do was to follow the usual scientific procedure of publishing your results, as he wanted to keep them secret. So he filed them as a patent. And then he took the patent in the spring of 1934 to General Electric in the UK and said, I have a possible power source that will make coal and oil obsolete. And they laughed him out of the door. And then he went to the Army and he said the same thing. And they said, oh, this is science fiction.
Right.
But he did have connections with um, F.A. Lindemann, who later became Churchill's science advisor. And
Right.
Lindemann persuaded the Navy, the Admiralty, to take this patent and make it a secret patent. So Szilard would have a patent and it would be credited to him eventually, but nobody else would know about it.
Right.
And so, starting in 1936, Szilard, to keep his chain reaction patent secret, had it filed with the Admiralty.
And it is very interesting to imagine how different the world might have possibly been had he published this or told a lot of other scientists about it. Because as we know, uh, about the same time, Enrico Fermi was bombarding elements with neutrons in Italy. Frederick and Irene Joliot-Curie were doing the same thing in France. And
Right.
you think that if any of them had heard about this idea, at least a few of them would have taken it seriously and then started
Sure.
looking for that element. So, so he
A lot
files.
once said that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize because he did not systematically test all the elements to see which ones might produce a chain reaction.
Right,
In
right.
his
As
talk,
Fermi did.
he mentions uranium, he mentions beryllium, and he mentions indium. And he started in a very half-assed way to test certain elements to see if in fact they might tip a chain reaction. But he never had much money, and he samples he left in places in Oxford and London, and he never really got to it. So he thought if we had the money and had systematically tested all these things, then long before nuclear fission was announced in December of 1938, the Germans might have been onto it. So
Right.
he should get the Nobel Peace Prize for not testing
Not
his
testing. And
theory.
yeah, and as we know, Fermi did test every element systematically. And
Yeah,
in retrospect, we do know that he missed discovering fission very narrowly
yeah,
because he had actually bombarded uranium, but
right,
the equipment that he was using was not sensitive enough to detect
right.
the ionization pulses that result from uranium fission. Um, so that's Szilard in 1933. He files the patent, comes up with this idea. I want to talk a little bit about the years between 1933 and 1939 when fission was actually discovered. So during those years, he was quite the peripatetic, just sort of wandering
Oh,
around
yeah,
between institutions, and he was creative enough to even think of potentially going to India. Wasn't that right?
he did. Yeah, he wasn't sure where he could go. I mean, certainly couldn't go back to Germany and then or to Austria or to Hungary. Uh,
Hmm.
and India uh, seemed to him, well, he thought of two places. He thought of the Soviet Union and he thought of India because both had good scientific
Right.
uh, um, facilities and talent. And he with what was happening with Stalin and the show trials and everything, he didn't find the Soviet Union very attractive. But he did. Uh, he was in England, and England at that point still had India as a colony, and it was part of the British Empire, and he thought it would be an attractive place to go to pursue his research. And he had several correspondences, but it turned out he got more and more involved with what he was doing in Europe, and never did actually pursue that. But it was something he seriously considered.
Right. Yeah, and that would have been interesting unto itself. But as it turned out, he did end up coming to the United States. Now, was that before or after fission was discovered at the end of
Before,
38? Before.
yeah, he came to the U.S. In 1934. He messed around with some people at New York University. He came in 35, and he actually started thinking he ought to file for citizenship. Uh, he was already predicting that things were going to be troublesome, and he found the United States to be an appealing place. He met Edward Lawrence at a conference in 1935 in Washington, and, and heard about um, research here. In fact, Szilard thought of the cyclotron before Lawrence did, and he
Hmm.
filed a patent for it. But it was Lawrence who got all the credit,
Yeah,
not because of that exchange.
right.
So Szilard was looking already to the United States as a place where he would eventually settle, and he was having dinner in 1938. Um, in Cambridge, and he said, "Well, a year before the war, I'm going to go to the United States." And so, the end of 38, he sailed for New York, and it was 9 months before the war,
For
not
the
a year.
war, as
But
prescient as always.
people, people like Maurice Goldhaber, who was there, remember that a year before the war, I'm going to go to the U.S.
Yeah. I always think since you mentioned working on the cyclotron even before Lawrence did, uh, and I have written about this in an article a couple of years back. Szilard would have been right at home in a place like Silicon Valley, where people are inventing new things all the time, and everyone is a futurist. They're inventing things that all for the future. He would have been extremely entrepreneurial because he was also very good at asking people for money and getting money to run his experiments.
Francois Jacob, who won the Nobel Prize in biology for one of Szilard's ideas, called Szilard an intellectual bumblebee. And he just loved going around and cross-pollinating ideas between different fields and different labs. Um, in the late 1940s, he tried to arrange um, for a roving professorship.
Mm,
So he could spend a few months at each university
mm,
and like a bumblebee, pollinate all around.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
That almost came to pass with a grant, and then in the late 50s, and then he developed bladder cancer and um, ended up doing other things,
Mm,
being an intellectual bumblebee, but among things, curing his own cancer. But
right.
it was
Yep.
something that I think Silicon Valley would be terrific. He liked the sunshine. He loved San Diego for the weather. He came here in 1956 for the first time to consult with the General Atomics, which was building new reactors. And he just loved San Diego. And he said he liked it because it gave him a foretaste of paradise. And
Mm,
as a result, he encouraged Jonas Salk to put the Salk Institute here. And he became one of the first fellows of the Salk Institute for biological studies. So, I mean, in that sense, freewheeling in a nice climate, as you would do in Silicon Valley, as well as San Diego, was
right.
something quite appealing to Szilard.
Yeah. And, we'll talk about his time in San Diego in a few minutes, but this is always something that I think we should appreciate more about people like Szilard, who have an enormous indirect influence by encouraging other people to embark on certain lines of investigation in science. They may not do the research themselves, but
Yeah.
just through conversations, they enormously influence other people. And I think we need to have a better appreciation for those people. But going back to 1939, so fission is discovered. That really shakes everyone up. Szilard was not invited. He was not part of the Washington Conference of Theoretical Physics, where Niels Bohr announced fission. Was he at the conference? I don't think
No,
so.
no, he was not. But he heard about the way it worked out. Um, well, it's interesting. On the 21st of December in 1938 is when fission was discovered in Berlin. And it was announced in the journals. And Niels Bohr, early in January of 39, came to the US and went to Princeton. And it was there that he shared this idea. And that's how Szilard heard about it.
Right.
And then a week or so later, he and Fermi went to George Washington University and announced it more widely to the
Hmm.
scientific community. Uh, and that's how the implications of nuclear fission spread
Right.
in the U.S.
Yeah. Now, wasn't once the discovery was announced, wasn't Szilard, at least at the beginning, a proponent of keeping studies on fission secret and
Oh
not
yeah,
publishing them?
he said I invented secrecy. He was afraid that the Germans would recognize the military potential of this, and he didn't write to anyone in Germany, but he wrote to Joliot-Curie and in France, and he wrote to people in England, uh, and he said we should really not publish any of our research about uranium uh, because of the military potential.
Right.
And it turns out that fission was announced, I think it was the first week in January in a journal. It was discovered late
Yeah, Frisch.
September, and a couple of weeks later it was
Right.
published.
Otto Frisch, I believe.
In March of 1939, the Germans assigned research about nuclear fission and the potential for weapons to the Army.
Right.
The U.S. didn't do that until June
Later.
of 1942. But the Germans were way ahead of us for more than 2 years.
Right. Right.
And I mean, they saw the potential right away.
Yeah.
So Szilard was trying to keep all this secret, but the French continued to publish, and really the word was out.
Right. And of course, he was right in asking scientists not to publish, but the irony there as well, as you know, is that in the Soviet Union, the disappearance of studies on fission in the United States immediately alerted Soviet physicists to the fact that something was up, and
Right.
that their own physicists to start investigating fission. So there's always two sides to everything. I always find that interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, so now that leads, he clearly saw the urgency of nuclear weapons before anyone else, and that leads to what is probably the most famous chapter in his life, at least as far as the general public is concerned. And I really want to emphasize that event because a lot of people are still not aware of it, which was drafting the letter that Einstein signed or that he co-wrote with Einstein and that Einstein sent to FDR. And even today, a lot of, it's interesting. Netflix has a new show called Einstein and the Atomic Bomb. I think that's the title of the show. And there is no mention of Szilard in that. And I think that's very common. A lot of people who know about Einstein's letter to FDR, they still don't realize that without Szilard, Einstein may have never written it. In fact, he didn't even know about it.
You didn't know about it. It's interesting, yes. Eugene Wigner at Princeton and Szilard, then living near Columbia University in New York City, were really quite concerned about the possibility that Germany would be building a weapon. And so Szilard never drove a car, so he got Wigner to drive him to Long Island, where Einstein was spending the summer at a friend's cottage. And the picture on the cover of the book shows Einstein and Szilard drafting the letter. This comes from a recreation they did in 1946. But they went out and they explained to Einstein the chain reaction. He said, I hadn't thought of that at all. And of course he hadn't. He was much more theoretical in his thinking.
Right.
But he saw immediately the significance and the threat. And Szilard proposed writing to the president because he liked going to the top, but Roosevelt had never heard of Szilard, but he had certainly heard of Einstein. And so he was really trading on Einstein's fame. And he admired Einstein, he said, because a lot of scientists would have been afraid to do something like this because it was only theoretical at this point and they didn't want to be embarrassed. And he said, one of the reasons that Einstein was so good was that he didn't care whether it was right or not. It was important to do. And he was already famous and he had his Nobel Prize. So
yeah, what did he have to lose?
So he agreed to sign the letter to Roosevelt, which led eventually to the Manhattan Project and to the A-bomb.
Yeah. And so after that letter is sent to FDR, it kickstarts the effort here to build the bomb. As we know, it goes on pretty slowly for the first 2 years, the Uranium Committee and so on. And you have told the story really well. Our mutual friend Richard Rhodes has also told the story really well in the making of the atomic bomb. But at that point, Szilard teams up with Enrico Fermi in Chicago because Fermi is building the nuclear reactor there. And that's where, as you
Well,
mentioned
actually,
earlier,
they met in New York.
oh, they met in New York.
Yeah, it goes right back. It was very fortuitous that in January of 1939, even before Bohr comes over to talk about the fission of uranium, um, Enrico Fermi and his family check in to the King's Crown Hotel, which is up the street from Columbia University. And Szilard was living there. Szilard only lived in hotels for most of his life. And so in January of 1939, it turns out the two people most likely to create a chain reaction met for the first time in New York City. And they started talking about this. And then Szilard borrowed, he didn't have a formal connection.
Mm-hmm.
Fermi was a professor and
Mm-hmm.
a Nobel laureate and had graduate students and
Right,
everything. Szilard lived there, walk over and have lunch at the faculty club. He'd poke around, but he was really the intellectual bumblebee again. But
right.
the two of them started working, and Szilard borrowed some money, and they started building what they called exponential piles, which would be that you would have a stream of neutrons to bombard different elements and see, in fact, if extra neutrons came out. By
Mm-hmm.
the summer of 1939, at Columbia, Fermi and Szilard recognized that there was a potential. Now, Fermi thought, well, maybe a bomb in 50 years. Szilard was thinking, maybe in 5 years. And the two of them agreed on the process, but not on the application.
Right.
So in the summer of 1939, Fermi goes off to Ann Arbor to study cosmic rays, and he leaves Szilard at his hotel by Columbia University. And in an exchange of 7 letters over about 3 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
they co-designed the first reactor. And they
Mm-hmm.
had different concepts. Would it be immersed in water? Would the elements eventually be in a lattice work where you have uranium suspended in graphite? And that became the successful design for the first reactor.
Pile.
It
Yeah.
was way before Chicago, because
Right.
by December or January of December of 39, January of 1940, Szilard was looking for places around New York where he might build a reactor. And there was a polo club, and there was a golf course, and there was an airplane hangar in New Jersey and in New York, the suburbs. And he was thinking about doing this. And then by that time, the U.S. was alerted to the point where they thought they really should get something going. And so Szilard and Fermi in 39 and in 40 and in 41 had these piles and came to the conclusion that a reactor is certainly possible.
Right.
And it was in the end of 41, I should say, that he was looking for an old airplane hangar where he could do this outside the city. But then in the spring of 42, the US government stepped in and consolidated their work in Chicago. So
Right.
that's how
The
Fermi
metro.
and Szilard moved from New York to Chicago.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting background. I believe fission was, at least in the US here, fission was demonstrated experimentally first at Columbia, um, right? And then at the Carnegie Institution. But
Well, I mean, the letter to FDR begins, some recent work by E. Fermi and L.
and
Szilard
right, right. So
uh,
they've already done that.
leads me to believe, so
Yeah.
they knew by the summer of 39 at
Yeah.
Columbia that this was a real possibility.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like you said, they were the first they were the only two men who were working on this at the forefront and really demonstrating fission at that point in time.
What's really terrible is that when they tried, the Uranium Committee tried to give them some money, they were both enemy aliens because World War II had
He
begun.
was a citizen yet.
And so the Army Intelligence and Security does a report, and they say, well, no, Fermi is clearly a fascist and can't be trusted with these ideas. And Szilard is sympathetic to Nazi Germany because he had been
Opposite.
awarded German citizenship when he was teaching
Oh,
Berlin. And so the line was clearly this secret work should not be entrusted to these two people. The only secret work in the world was in their heads.
exactly. They were the only two people capable
But
of.
eventually Einstein spoke to the FBI, and even though they were still enemy aliens, they finally got the money they needed at Chicago, I mean at Columbia, to continue their work.
Right, right. So moving on to Chicago, the first pile or reactor becomes successful in December 1942. And I always find the collaboration between Szilard and Fermi very interesting, not just for the work that they achieved, but because they had such different personalities.
Sure.
Fermi, as we know, was an extremely methodical, extremely organized, clear thinker. Szilard had his own way of organizing his thoughts. You wouldn't call him disorganized, but he is
Well,
not
he would soak
like
in the bathtub for hours like Archimedes. Every morning he would soak in the tub and think up ideas. And then he'd walk off to the faculty club for lunch at Columbia, and then he'd go and look in on Fermi. And he did the same thing at the University of Chicago. It was his habit.
Yeah. Well, and so as far as we know, um, based on your book as well as Rhodes's book, I get the feeling that Fermi was not always very happy with Szilard's style of working, and he sort he respected his intellect and his brilliance, but the two never worked together again after they worked the pile, right? Um, so I know we have a few minutes left, so I want to run through a few topics that I think would be very interesting for people. Szilard, at the end of the Manhattan Project, he was a huge proponent of a demonstration of the bomb rather than dropping it directly. And he wrote to FDR, he wrote to Truman. He again went straight to the top. Um, and he also had a meeting, as you describe, and you have written a play about it with James Burns, who was about to become Truman's Secretary of State.
Sure.
Szilard also had he gave General Groves a lot of trouble. He was a real troublemaker as far as Groves was concerned. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, because didn't Groves even try to make efforts to have him put in jail for the duration of the war?
Well, Szilard said his hobby was baiting brass hats, and he was really he was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army, but he wasn't very happy about it, and he took an instant dislike to General Groves when Groves came to Chicago for the first time in the fall of 1942, and he spoke out and he asked questions, and he was impertinent to Groves, who had just been made a general when he became head of this new project. So before the end of the year, Groves is trying to have Szilard locked up. He's an enemy alien. He didn't become a citizen until 43. And he goes up through the chain of command right to the office of the Secretary of War, saying Szilard for security should be interred for the duration of the war. But Compton, who was running the metallurgical lab in Chicago, said that can't be. No, Szilard's too important. But from that point on, Groves had Szilard followed by agents. He said, find any trace you can that he's disloyal, that he's a spy, that he's disruptive, and I can get him off the project.
But they
and
couldn't find anything.
they were like oil and water, and they
Right, right.
had,
And so a related question, and that brings me to the Oppenheimer movie, is Szilard's relationship with Oppenheimer. I
yeah,
mean, they have shown in the movie that he did meet with Oppenheimer and tried, well, at least in the movie, he met with Oppenheimer and tried to get Oppenheimer to sign the petition to demonstrate the bomb instead of dropping it. And one interesting fact about that is that it was signed by 155 scientists, that
right.
petition. So it was certainly not a minor, some people think that demonstrating the bomb was a minority opinion. And that it doesn't feel like that.
Right.
What was the relationship between Oppenheimer and Szilard like, in
Well,
context to
they
what's in the
never
movie?
worked together professionally.
Right.
Szilard was always on the East Coast, or then in Chicago, and Oppenheimer was always on the West Coast or in the Southwest in New Mexico. Um, but their paths did cross in a curious way. Szilard, as early as 1944, was going to Bush and Conant, who were the civilian heads of the atomic program, saying you should talk to Roosevelt about international control of this weapon after the war. And in the movie, one of the pitches that Szilard is making to Oppenheimer is to argue for international control.
Mm-hmm.
Because by the spring of 1945, Oppenheimer was on a committee, the interim committee, as a scientific advisor. And Szilard was trying all sorts of ways to argue for international control and for a demonstration of the bomb. And so he got another Einstein letter to Roosevelt in March saying Dr. Szilard should talk to the cabinet about international control. And FDR died.
Mm-hmm.
So through connections at the Met Lab, he got to go to the White House to talk to Truman. And Truman sends him to Spartanburg, South Carolina to talk to Jimmy Burns, who's about to become Secretary of State. And he brings along Harold Urey, who's a Nobel laureate, also from the Manhattan Project. And at that point, Burns says the bomb is going to make Russia more manageable after the war. We have to use it. No demonstration. So then he goes back 2 days later, back to Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and back to General Groves's own office, and arranges through Groves's secretary to meet Oppenheimer. And he knows Oppenheimer is on this committee, and he makes a big pitch that you have to argue for international control. It has to be part of whatever we do here.
Mm-hmm.
Oppenheimer ridiculed him. He said, the bomb is shit. And Szilard said, what do you mean? Well, it has no military value. It's just a shock weapon. That's all it is. And so he had this one confrontation with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer did mention international control in the committee, but he never pursued it. What's even
Right.
worse is that when Szilard sent copies of his petition to Los Alamos, he sent a copy to his friend Edward Teller, and
Who took it?
Teller took it to Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer said, no, we can't circulate this. It isn't our job as scientists to be able to make policy. Well, he was so hypocritical about this.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I think Oppenheimer doesn't come across very well in those episodes. I think the problem was, in my mind, he was too much of an insider at that point and kind of too much part of the establishment, really. And Szilard was still much more, he could afford to think more independently. But you would think that Oppenheimer, who had such eloquent powers of persuasion, would have adopted that approach a little more as well.
what's interesting about Oppenheimer is he's now remembered and was actually persecuted for
Or
his
international control.
for international control. He helped the Atchison Lilienthal committee when they were just drafting a U.S. proposal to the UN for international control in the spring of 1946.
Right.
But what's interesting to me, and it comes out in the book by Kai Bird and Marty Sherwin called American Prometheus, is that Oppenheimer was gung-ho for the bomb until it worked, and then when it was used. And only about a month later, in September, he starts having serious second thoughts about that. And then he eventually becomes someone who agrees with Szilard and others that we need civilian control after the war, not military control. And he was an advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission, and for other reasons than you would say humanitarian, but for other reasons, practical reasons, he said we should not develop the hydrogen bomb. We don't
Right.
really need it, and uranium is too scarce, and plutonium is too scarce, and we ought to build up a regular arsenal. Well, for
Right.
that, thanks to Teller and Louis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Oppenheimer was later punished.
Right. And you know what's so one reason I admire Leo Szilard is because Szilard just appears much more consistent compared to someone like Oppenheimer, who seemed to keep on changing his mind, partly depending on what way the currents were going. Ultimately, he said some very wise things about the bomb and international control, but Szilard kind of got there first. But I'm glad you mentioned Strauss because Szilard had been a long time well, I don't know if we can call him a friend of Louis Strauss, but
He
he
was a
had known him
colleague.
for a long time.
He was a colleague in the
He was a
late
colleague.
30s. One of Strauss's parents had died from cancer, and Szilard, beginning in 39, was in New York City, and he thought of radiation treatment for cancer. And he met with Strauss, who was then a banker, and talked about different medical applications of radioactivity. So Strauss already respected Szilard as a scientist and as somebody with concerns about applying peaceful uses of atomic energy. So that
Right.
was their first connection.
Yeah.
And then even during the war, Strauss was then an admiral, and he had an office down on the mall in Washington, D.C., and at one point, Szilard visited him, and they remembered their time together. But it was as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission that Strauss created real mischief, especially for
Oh yeah.
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, but I find it interesting that as part of as being someone who tried to have a good relationship with many people, Szilard seemed to maintain a good relationship with Strauss on one hand, and a cordial relationship with Oppenheimer on the other. Although Strauss and Oppenheimer didn't get along as well, so I
Right.
find it admirable that he was cordial and friends with people who could be each other's sworn enemies. And I think von Neumann was like that as well. In spite of being a hawk, von Neumann testified at Oppenheimer's security trial. I'm assuming Szilard was not even invited to testify for or against
No,
Oppenheimer.
but
Part of that.
he did play an important role.
Uh-huh.
He heard about the trial. He was then living in New York City, and he came down the night before Teller was going to testify, and he wanted to try to find Teller and say, "Don't testify. It's just going to divide the community, and it's
Right.
unnecessary." And of course, the lawyers for uh, uh, Strauss and the AEC had Teller locked up and inaccessible. So
Mm.
Szilard chases around Washington, D.C., looking for Teller. And he comes back to the hotel room and he says, I can't find Teller. And if I don't find Teller, I'll have to defend Oppenheimer for the rest of my life. Because he didn't like Oppenheimer personally because of the hypocrisy about how much power
Right. Right.
scientists ought to have. But
And
at that point, and from then on, he defended the security uh,
right.
integrity of Oppenheimer.
Right. And as you know, both Hans Bethe and Szilard tried to convince Taylor not to testify. But
Yeah.
what you said reminds me of something else, which is when Fermi heard about Oppenheimer's trial, he of course was going to testify in favor of Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
But he said, "Oh, why did they have to do it to Oppenheimer? Why couldn't they do it to some nice guy like Hans Bethe? Because it would be much easier for me to testify in favor of Bethe than Oppenheimer." So Oppenheimer was clearly a somewhat divisive figure. I mean, he said a lot of wise things
He was personally arrogant
and
and
personally arrogant.
remote and obscure in his behavior now and then. I don't think he was sociable the way a number of people like von Neumann certainly were sociable. But I think he was thrust into that position at Los Alamos and succeeded. And it may have gone to his head in a way that, I mean, he was on the cover of Time magazine.
And life, yeah.
That does something to you, doesn't it?
I think that's what happened. He got too close to the center of power, and when he tasted power, he liked it. And that's where the Prometheus analogy holds up. He flew too close to the sun and
Yeah.
had his wings clipped. So in the last few minutes, I want to focus on the last 2 decades or so of Szilard's life. In particular, I want to focus on um, one of the most interesting developments in his life after the war, which was his turn towards biology from physics. And as you know, he was certainly not unique among physicists in turning towards biology. Francis Crick was another physicist. George Gamow, who I assume Szilard knew well, also turned to biology. Um,
Erwin Schrödinger.
Erwin Schrödinger, again, famous.
Szilard taught courses in physics with Schrödinger in Berlin. And so he knew a lot of these people personally who became pioneers in biology.
Right. And one thing that strikes me is that a lot of the formal accounts of molecular biology don't mention Szilard too much. I know Watson does mention him in his memoir, but as usual, he again seemed to be the genius in the shadows when it came to biology, just like in physics. For instance, I don't think he was part of the RNA tie club that was started by Gamow. You probably know this, but Gamow actually did some early work on the genetic code. He came up with his own idea of the genetic code, which was not correct, but it got other people like Watson and Crick thinking about it. But Szilard, so Gamow was someone who was tuned in much more into the group of biologists, the mainstream group of biologists like Watson and Crick and Sidney Brenner and so on. What connection did Szilard have with that core group of molecular biologists, if any?
It's interesting. It goes back to the 30s.
Hmm.
He was a physicist in Berlin in 31, and so was Delbruck,
Right.
Max Delbruck. And Delbruck at that point, and even Niels Bohr at that point in the early 30s, was getting interested in biology. And Szilard at that point in 31, he was lecturing about physics at the university, but he talked to Delbruck about biology becoming the next theoretical field.
Hmm.
And so then Hitler comes in and Szilard ends up in London. And while he's running around finding jobs for all these refugees, he's also deciding he wants to take up biology. And he goes to A.V. Hill, who was another physicist turned to biology at the University of London, and has arranged a teaching position in physiology so that he can learn
More.
biology. And then he thinks up the chain reaction. And his life is just completely
Changed.
occupied until after the war. Once General Groves has him fired from the Manhattan Project, and he, in 1946, says, "I can finally get back to biology."
Right.
And then he got into this group. There were a bunch of people in the Midwest, Joshua Lederberg
Correct.
and
Yeah.
Salvador Luria.
Hmm.
And Szilard used to organize dinners for them. And that's, again, the bumblebee. In fact, he would pull these people together and let them talk and hear them, and then they'd go back to their universities. And so he was active in, I think, cross-pollinating a lot of early molecular biology work, but he never had any official position. He
Right.
had a part-time lab he set up at the University of Chicago, but he didn't become a specialist to the point that wins people Nobel Prizes, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, he was again out of the mainstream, and but again had this enormous indirect influence on people like Luria and Lederberg. And isn't it true that one of the reasons, and I think this is again a lesson for modern day scientists and students, isn't it true that one of the reasons he went into biology is because he realized that biology was not a very developed field,
Right.
while physics was much more developed at that point, and so there were many more opportunities to make major discoveries in biology.
He said it would be the next theoretical field. It wasn't theoretical at that point. It was pretty practical
Right.
and physical. Yeah, he saw the potential. Uh, a number of biologists have said, well, but physics and biology are different. Biology has its own methods. And Szilard loved the fact that you could do an experiment and it would be done, and 20 minutes later you could do another one, you could do another one. I mean, it was just a very volatile field. Whereas with physics, you have to set it up and you have to get the right machine and you have to calibrate and
Right.
everything else.
And
So
you know,
he loved the vitality, uh, if you use that word in many senses, of biology.
right, right. Well, also what is interesting, and I'm sure you appreciate this, is that by that time, physics had become quite expensive, especially nuclear physics, particle physics. You had to build these big accelerators to make important discoveries. Back when Rutherford was doing it, you could do it with tabletop experiments. You could do it with a few
Sure.
$100s. And interestingly, biology was like that in the 50s, where you could set up some simple experiments with a few
Sure.
$100s and find out something important. And I'm sure that really challenged Szilard's mind. You know, one quote I remember, Richard Dawkins once said that physics is all about the fundamental theories and biology is all about the complexity.
Right.
And, you know, one can see how that complexity would have challenged a mind like Leo Szilard, like Leo Szilard at that
Well,
point.
one of the attitudes that Szilard had was to be contrarian, and
Mm,
he challenged his tutors and he challenged his professors, and um, he would often look for, I won't say wacky, but a very different way of approaching things. And in the case of the negative feedback regulation of enzyme activity, this was being studied at the Institut Pasteur in Paris in the 50s by Monod and Jacob.
hmm.
And Szilard dropped in. The bumblebee, he would come in and he would brainstorm, he would talk to people, and then he'd go off to Berlin, go to Rome, go somewhere else. And he challenged them, and he said that this this enzyme uh, activity might be a negative feedback rather than a positive feedback. And Monod first thought that was nonsense, and then he said, well, we tested it and it turned out to be true. And Monod and Jacob won the 1965 Nobel Prize for that idea. And at their lecture in Stockholm, they credit Szilard with pressing this idea on them that they thought was nonsense until they tried it. Now that was the year after Szilard had died, so he never really learned. He did know that they had published these results, but he didn't know that his idea actually won a Nobel Prize.
Right. Yeah, another example of the enormous indirect influence. I mean, Jacob and Monod's discovery of genetic regulation is one of the most important in the history of
Yeah,
biology, and people don't appreciate Szilard's influence. So the last few years, one or 2 points I want to touch in the last few minutes is um, he was as active during the Cold War in trying to avert nuclear war as he was during the Manhattan Project and shortly thereafter. And one of the things he did was again go straight to the top and get in touch with Nikita Khrushchev,
right.
the Soviet Union. And I know there's some amusing story about him offering Khrushchev a year's worth of razor blades.
Right.
Isn't that true?
I
What
can
was that
explain
about?
that to you. Yeah. Szilard tried always to go to the top. In the late 40s, he published an open letter to Stalin saying that you should team up with Truman and you should give broadcasts to each other's people and really tone down what was becoming a, a Cold War. In 1957, he helped set up the Pugwash conferences on science and public affairs, which brought Soviet and American scientists together behind the scenes. And it was through those connections that he got to see Khrushchev in New York City in 1960.
Hmm.
Szilard was then in the hospital finishing off his procedure for eradicating bladder cancer, and Khrushchev had come to the UN, and through some Pugwash conference friends, he had an arrangement to actually meet Khrushchev in the Soviet delegation office. And they got together, and he was given 15 minutes. It wasn't, but he wanted to talk to Khrushchev about the hotline. He had heard from somebody that a hotline would be one way that you could defuse any rumors or any misinformation,
Right, right.
and it might lead to a nuclear war. And so he talked to Khrushchev about that, and they became very genial. They talked for 2 hours. It turned out they really liked each other. And Szilard brought along a Schick Injecto razor, which was the latest thing, the way you switch the blade or
Right,
something.
right, yeah.
And so he gives this to Khrushchev. In the book, I have the actual dialogue, but I'm paraphrasing. And he says, "Here, I'd like to give you this razor," and he said, "But I have to tell you, if there's a nuclear war, I'm not going to send you any replacement blades." And to which Khrushchev said, "Well, if there's a nuclear war, we won't be shaving. So
Right,
don't."
that's right. No, no one would be around. Khrushchev certainly had his dark sense of humor. I think that
Well,
was
he had and Khrushchev had a funny line about the hotline proposal. Uh, Szilard is trying to say, well, this is going to make sure that the president and the premier are in constant touch. And Khrushchev says to him, well, I go to the beach and they bring a phone right down to the beach. He said, I have to go in the water to get away from this. So he found the notion of a hotline to be a pain in the neck in one way, and he
right.
said, I have to
What
go
what is
swimming in order to get away from this phone.
that is very funny. And you said this conversation took place in 1960.
1960, yeah.
So clearly, the hotline idea was a very good idea during the Cuban Missile Crisis in
It didn't come
62.
about till afterwards,
Yeah,
but it was an urgent reply uh, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It had been kicked around and they were talking about it, but
Hmm.
that showed how important it could actually be.
Right. So Szilard spent the last few years of his life in La Jolla and in San Diego. And was he officially at the Salk Institute that he encouraged Jonas Salk to establish?
He was. He first went there in the 50s as a consultant to General Atomics, and he fell in love with the place. And he was talking, he was then living in Washington 61 to 64, and he got involved in the discussions for creating what became the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. he and the chemist William Deering came up with a proposal to create a new study center. And it would have two components. There would be hard science, and there would be the study of the social consequences of science. There would be those two pillars. And Szilard sold this idea. There's a picture of him meeting Salk for the first time in '57 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and pitching this idea. And Salk had a lot of money from the March of Dimes, and he wanted to create some kind of a research institute. But he was thinking of doing it at the University of Pittsburgh. And at one point, Szilard said, "Listen, Jonas, no first-rate scientist is going to move to Pittsburgh. But I'll tell you where they should move." And he loved La Jolla, California, San Diego. He said, "You should put it in San Diego." And then through other connections, Szilard made arrangements so that Salk could talk to people at the University of California that was just setting up a campus in San Diego. And eventually, the mayor of San Diego, who had polio, gave Salk some property that the city had, and that's where the Salk Institute was set up. Szilard came out in January of '64 to become one of the first fellows, along with Francis Crick and Renato Del Becco and some other famous scientists. So he was one of the first fellows of the Salk Institute.
Yeah, and so he spent what, the last 10 years of his life or so in La Jolla?
No, only about 5 months.
Oh, only about 5 months. So he
He
died
had come.
quickly.
He was in and out because of his work at General Atomics. But once they decided that the Salk Institute should be there, he was instrumental in having it founded, and he was then lobbying the Kennedy and then the Johnson White House on arms control and getting very frustrated. And he thought it would be wonderful to be a fellow in San Diego. And so he moved out in January of '64. But he was instrumental in New York and other places in getting the whole institute founded.
Yeah. And in his last few years, I don't want to digress too much, but I think we should mention her. He was supported, he got a lot of support from his wife, Trude Weiss, and she lived in New York, right?
Pardon?
Did she live in La Jolla as well, or
They moved there together. Yeah,
they
it's the
moved there
first place
together? So
they
she
lived
she was
together.
there.
Yeah, she had, when he had cancer, Victor Weisskopf used to joke about Szilard, saying that he had an office in Chicago, he lived in a hotel in New York, and he had a wife in Denver. And she was a medical doctor and a researcher at the University of Denver. But he would frequently go out there, and he loved going to the Rockies. But they didn't really live in the same place
For too long.
until 1961, when he was lobbying the White House, and they lived in the DuPont Plaza Hotel near the White House. And then in '64, they rented a bungalow in La Jolla, and that's really '61 to '64 is the first time they actually lived together. But they otherwise had a long distance marriage that began in '51. Yeah.
Right. I think I mentioned this to you, but George Dyson has a wonderful story of meeting Trude Weiss when he was a kid. And Freeman Dyson, as you know, worked in La Jolla at General Atomics.
Right.
And that's when George used to visit La Jolla. And she was wonderful with children, as was Leo, right?
Right. Yeah, Szilard liked kids. In fact, he said, you really have to be like a child if you want to be creative in science, because you can't start with a bunch of premises. You have to start with only questions, basic questions, and answer them, not disprove or prove some other concept. And he loved kids. He wrote some charming stories for kids. And he one of his commandments has to do with children.
Hmm.
You know, in the original commandments, it's honor thy father and thy mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
Szilard says is his eighth commandment: honor children, listen reverently to their words, and speak to them with infinite love.
Hmm.
So he considered himself a kid in many ways, in terms of his imagination and in terms of his sometimes carefree attitudes.
He certainly shared that childlike curiosity with his friend Einstein.
Oh yeah,
Also spoke to the same quality. So there's a really wonderful story that you have told about his. Uh, well, it's a story about what he wanted done with his ashes after he died.
yeah,
So maybe we can conclude with that because I just love that story.
sure. Um, he wanted his ashes put in balloons and lofted. He said so that people don't look down, they look up, and that it would delight all the children. Well, he died in 1964, and his relatives out here tried briefly releasing some ashes, but of course, with the west wind, the ashes kept blowing back onto the sand, and that was not really successfully done. um, um, but then when the Szilard centenary came up in 1998, the Hungarian Science Academy said, we want some of his ashes. Uh, and they had a very Hungarian arrangement, and half the ashes went to Budapest. And the other half went to Ithaca, New York, where his wife Trudy's family um, um, had 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 uh, had settled, and where Trudy was buried.
Hmm.
So half his ashes are in Budapest, and half his ashes are in uh, La Jolla. Now, two things happened at La Jolla. One is that they did attach some of his ashes to balloons and release them, and they went drifting off towards the Atlantic. And his great grandnieces and nephews made sure that was happening. The second thing is that Hans Bethe came to the interment, and he remembered, he said, and has told me, and I quote in the book, that in the 30s, Szilard was moving all over Europe trying desperately to find jobs and positions for people. And we thought he could be in two places at the same time, like one of the new particles. And and Bethe said at the interment, and he said, well, in the 30s, we thought that Szilard could be in two places at the same time, and now we know it's true. He's in, he's in Budapest and he's in Ithaca.
Yeah, his ashes, just like him, were peripatetic. Exactly. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Bill. Thanks so much for your time.
Delightful. Thank you for these wonderful questions.
No, no, it was, I mean, Leo Szilard, an enormously creative, imaginative, but also a very wise and humane man. What would you say if we had to remember one or two things about him? I mean, I always think how would he have thought about the world today as we confront these new dangers of rising nationalism, of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering? What would have been his message for the world today?
Well, I think, first of all, he would be fearless in taking on any question, and he would insist on pushing aside most conventional wisdom and looking for some surprise, unexpected approach to things. He always liked to, as we say, think outside the box. And he would certainly be doing that with all sorts of scientific and also political problems. Um, I think he personifies the scientist who considers that he's not just wearing a lab coat and messing around with Erlenmeyer flasks, that he's a citizen of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's important as a citizen of the world to care about social and political events. And his ideas were sometimes wacky, but they would be new ideas and they would be fresh and people would build on them. They would at least take him seriously, even if he sometimes didn't take himself quite as seriously as he wanted. But he said science should really thrive from scientists having leisure and just brainstorming and relating in different ways. And he also believed that all he had to do was come up with good ideas and then give them to people in power. So he wasn't interested in building his own power base in any sense. So I would just say to be freewheeling in your thoughts and to always think of humanity as the ultimate beneficiary of science.
That's a very fitting message, and I think an enduring legacy for our times. Thanks very much, Bill.
Thank you, Ash. It's been a real pleasure.
Yep. All right.